Hello and welcome to a video from Grow Light Central. Today we're going to look at our grow light buying guide. There's so many options out there when you're trying to buy a grow light that it can be a little overwhelming, and in this video we're going to try to help you out with that. If you prefer to read the guide, you can find it on our website. There's a link in the description below. When it comes to grow lights, there are basically three options, and we're going to look at all three today. The first one is fluorescent lights, the second are HID lights, and the third are LED lights. Let's begin with fluorescent lights. These are the simplest form of grow light. You can find fluorescent grow lights at any hardware store or Walmart or whatever. You can also find them online. We sell them on our site. You might pay a little more online depending on what sales they have going on in stores, but it is more convenient. Alright, so who would want to buy fluorescent grow lights? So you want to choose fluorescent grow lights if you're on a budget and if you're only growing a plant or two. If you're trying to save money, this is the way to do it. These things are cheap, and for one or two plants, it's not really that big a deal that they're less efficient than other bulbs. The thing is, they're not that powerful, so they work great for vegging, but when it comes to flowering, they don't really give you quite the yields that other bulbs would. But again, you're trying to save money, so that's a lower priority. Alright, you would also want fluorescent lights if you're only vegging or cloning. As I said before, they're really good for vegging, and same for cloning. The fact that they're weaker doesn't really make a difference, so you can save a lot by going with fluorescence for that. And this goes together with the last point. If you're setting up a clone room, like specifically just to clone plants, you can use fluorescence. They're excellent for this because they radiate less heat. You can hang them very close to the plants. You would probably not use CFLs though, which is the bulb pictured here. You would use a T5. Those are the long tubes that you see often in offices and such. And because you can hang them so close to the plants, it allows you to have a very compact cloning space. So you could even put it under a bed if the bed is high enough, or in a low closet, or you can fit it into a tight space. And finally, you'll want to use fluorescence if you're just looking for supplemental lighting. This is actually their best use, and this is what I use them for myself. If you're using HID light or LED light as your main light, then you can supplement that light with fluorescence. Most fluorescent bulbs give off a blue light, which makes them excellent for supplementing red heavy HPS and LED lights. There are also fluorescents that give off warmer red light. You could supplement with them too, but again, they don't give off that much power, so they're not really that good during flowering. What a lot of people do is actually use the HPS and LED lights overhead for the red light, and then supplement by hanging bluish fluorescent bulbs in between the plants, and this works well even during flowering. And there's actually an article on our site about this specific technique in the blog section. You can check that out if you're interested. Alright, let's move on to HID grow light. HID stands for high intensity discharge, and these are the most common and most popular type of grow lights, the ones that have been used for years and years and years, and they include metal halide bulbs and high pressure sodium bulbs. You would use HID grow lights if you're on a budget, but you want more output than fluorescence. So a complete HID kit costs a lot less than a quality LED light. It might cost more than fluorescence, but if you're looking at the wattage, if you're going watt per watt, you would actually pay less for HID than you would for fluorescence. So if you're getting 400 watts of HID light, that would cost you less than buying 400 watts of fluorescent light. One important factor to think about with HID lights is the heat. These bulbs, both HPS and MH bulbs, produce a ton of heat, and the stronger the bulb, so if you go up to 1,000 watts, you're getting a lot of heat, and you need to be able to deal with that. So you've got to have a well-ventilated grow room or a good cooling system, and it's going to cost you money, first to buy the system and then also to run it, in terms of electricity costs. Generally, people looking for maximum yields would also go with HID grow lights. LEDs, they're getting better and better, but as it stands now, they're still not quite giving the same yields as HPS bulbs are. They're close, but not quite there. That said, the buds grown under LED lights are usually a bit more potent though. So you got to think about what's more important to you, the larger yields or slightly higher quality yields, and then obviously take everything else into consideration too, cost and all that, and make your decision. And finally, if you're already familiar with HID lights, if you've been growing with them for a while, then it doesn't really make much sense to switch to LED at this point, unless you are specifically looking to lower your operating costs, right? Because basically growing with LEDs, it's going to be different. There are some changes you're going to need to get used to, and so the first few grows you will actually, your yields will suffer until you get used to the differences. And at this point, if you've got something that works, there's no real reason to change yet. Maybe wait a few years until the LED costs come down a bit more. Alright, and we've been mentioning LED grow lights a lot, and everybody mentions them a lot these days. They are the future, and let's look at who might want to buy LED grow lights today. The first one is people who can afford them. LED fixtures cost a lot more than the other options, so if you want to go with LED, you're going to have to pay a lot up front. If you want to minimize your operating costs, that's the main reason people go with LED lights, especially for larger grows, right? They consume less power, they generate less heat, which saves you even more money because you don't have to pay for the cooling equipment and pay to run the cooling equipment. And finally, the bulbs last over 50,000 hours, which is a lot more than HID bulbs, which last from like 6,000 to 12,000 hours. So you don't have to replace them very often. Overall, the operating costs will be a lot lower once you switch to LED lights, but of course, the initial cost is much higher. And finally, if you want to minimize heat, as we mentioned, LEDs run much cooler than other lights. On the flip side, in the winter, if you live in a cold area, you will actually have to heat your grow room, which is not something you would have to do with HID lighting. So that's something to think about too. And finally, if you have no previous growing experience and all the things above apply, mainly that you can afford them, then I would go with LED lights. There's no point really in getting HID lights and learning how to grow with them and then in a few years switching to LED and having to relearn everything. You might as well just learn how to use LED from the beginning. Alright, let's quickly summarize the pros and cons of each type of light. We'll start with the fluorescent grow lights. The advantages are minimal space requirements, cheap setup costs, they can be bought anywhere, like I said, Home Depot, Walmart, whatever, and they don't use much electricity or output much heat, but again, that's because they're usually pretty weak. If you buy the same amount of wattage in fluorescent lights as you would in HID lights, they would actually use more electricity and output more heat. Alright, the disadvantages of fluorescents, they're only effective for small grows. You have to keep your plants short because they just do not have the penetration that other light forms have. They are much less efficient than other lights, so if you get into larger grows where you need a lot of wattage, fluorescents don't make any sense. They're going to cost you more. Each bulb requires a socket, but that's true for HID lighting too. And they're going to need constant adjustment, and what that means is the plants grow very close to the fluorescent lights because they don't output much heat or power. You need to get the plants close, but the plants can't touch. If they touch, they will burn. So you're constantly having to move the fluorescents away as the plants grow. And that can be kind of a pain. Sometimes you have to do it several times a day. Alright, for HID lights, the advantages are the lower initial cost, just the fact that they've been effective for so many years and still are. They get deep penetration and a good coverage area, and they get the highest yields with HPS bulbs. For disadvantages, of course, the high power requirements and the fact that they run very hot. The bulbs also have a fairly short lifespan compared to other types of lighting. You need to hang them high above the plants due to the heat, so what this means is that you need a tall grow space. Taller than you would for fluorescents, definitely, and for LEDs also. And finally, each bulb requires a ballast and a socket or reflector. So similar to the fluorescents, you need a socket, but with HID grow lights, you will also need a ballast, and I guess you don't need a reflector, but you really want one because you're going to waste a lot of light if you don't have it. Alright, finally LED lights. The advantages are the lower operating cost, of course, the longer bulb life, the fact that they're more efficient. What that means is just you get more output for the watts you put in. So the electricity you pay for will give you a higher output of usable light. And with high quality LEDs, you can control the spectrum of the lighting, something we haven't mentioned before, but basically you can choose the color of light that your plants get. And so if you're in a stage, for example, vegging, where you don't need as much red light, you can turn off that red light and you save some power. And you're also not bombarding your plants with tons of green light like HID bulbs do, which is basically wasted light. The plants can't use that. So that's basically the reason why LEDs are more effective, because of the spectrum that is finely tuned toward plant growth. LEDs are easy to install. You basically hang them and plug them in, and there's no need for additional equipment. Like, you don't need a lot of cooling equipment, you don't need a ballast, you don't need reflectors. All that's included in the unit. The disadvantages, of course, the first one, the high initial cost. Finally, the fact that you have to heat them in cool climates in the winter. And maybe this shouldn't count as a disadvantage, but the fact that there are so many low quality lights on the market is kind of a problem. It makes it hard to know which LED grow light to buy because you don't want to end up with one that's useless, and many of them are. On our site, we only carry lights that have been proven to grow plants, but in general, if you're shopping for an LED light, just make sure you do your research. I'll mention it in a minute, but we also have a guide for buying LED lights that can help you out there as well. Finally, the learning curve when you're switching from HID. I mentioned that before. There are some differences, and it'll take you a few grows to get used to those differences. So if you're switching, your yields will probably suffer a bit at first. To buy some of these grow lights, you can go to our site, growlightcentral.com. We sell, as I mentioned, only lights that have been proven to grow plants, so you don't have to worry about buying low quality crap on our site. And we also have on our site the page that goes along with this video and the 2 follow-up pages, one that will guide you through the process of buying an LED grow light and another one for HID grow lights. We also have videos for both of those, and you can find them by just going to our channel. Alright, that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I hope this helped you out. Happy shopping!